Cheerleaders don't typically become bombers, but Bernadine Rae Dohrn is different. She would spend her 20s trying to overthrow the U.S. government through a radical group known as the Weather Underground. As a result of their bombings, she would make the FBI's top 10 most wanted list. Her drastic attempts would cause J. Edgar Hoover to call her, quote, the most dangerous woman in America. A radical revolution, bombings, and an 11-year escape from the FBI. That's coming up on Ladies Love Crime. Before Bernadine was dropping bombs, she was just the average girl next door. She grew up in the suburbs of Milwaukee to middle-class parents. She attended Miami University of Ohio before transferring to the University of Chicago. No matter where she went, she was always an activist. She tried to unionize her colleagues while working in the Illinois Department of Public Aid. While in graduate school, she volunteered for the Welfare Rights Organization to advocate for families. She went on to live in New York City, where she helped organize one of the very first anti-war demonstrations known as Draft Week. She had been fighting for the people for years. Now she was going to fight against the man. The year was 1969. Bernadine was at the Students for a Democratic Society convention. Things were tense. As described by the socialist magazine The Militant, from the moment the convention opened, it was dominated by the fierce factional struggle between supporters of the current national leadership of SDS. The magazine goes on to say that Bernadine, along with other SDS leaders, responded by declaring that it was impossible to remain in the same organization with people who opposed self-determination in practice and demanded an immediate split. Then Bernadine Dohrn announced she was walking out and invited all those who agreed with her to follow. The convention was in such total chaos that few people ever heard what she said. Less than half followed her out. From this split, the Weather Underground was born. Bernadine and her comrades, including her future husband Bill Ayers, was about to unleash their explosive ideology onto America. The FBI labeled the Weather Underground a domestic terrorist organization, but did the FBI help create them? In the spring of 1969, the FBI had civilian informants inside the Students for a Democratic Society. These informants were told to back a specific faction of this group, known as the National Office, a group that would eventually become the Weathermen. Bernadine walked out of the SDS convention with 600 people. The main cause of the split was the Weathermen's advocacy of violence to achieve their goals, whereas the SDS did not want to use violence. When the walkout occurred, dozens of FBI informants were among them. Why was the FBI getting involved with extremist groups? Shouldn't they be protecting us from extremist groups who perpetuate acts of violence? Here lies the dirty but not so secret history of the FBI. They've been infiltrating both sides of political movements for decades, and a lot of times the very actions that the FBI blames on these groups were actually committed by the FBI's own people. As noted by Time magazine in an article about the Weather Underground, the FBI believed, wrongly, that Weathermen, because it was countercultural and anarchic, was the least dangerous group in the SDS. They sure misjudged that one. The Weather Underground referred to themselves as the Weathermen. They got this name from a Bob Dylan song that contained the lyric, "You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind is blowing." Apparently to them, the wind was blowing to a revolution. Their first major demonstration came in October of 1969, known as the Days of Rage. The event drew only a couple hundred people. Before long, the protest escalated into a full-scale riot. The Weathermen began tearing through Chicago's upper-class Gold Coast neighborhood. They were smashing car windows, breaking into banks and businesses, and starting fires. Eventually, they breached barricades, and 500 cops descended on the area. After the tear gas faded, 28 police officers were injured, 6 Weathermen were shot, and another 68 were arrested. Just a few days later, at 27 years old, Bernadine Dohrn would become the 4th woman to make the FBI's most wanted list. She was wanted for unlawful interstate flight to avoid prosecution for mob action and violation of the federal anti-riot laws. While in hiding, she remained committed to the Weathermen. After the Days of Rage, the group retreated for a bit, but before long, they were back in full force. The following spring, 3 Weathermen were killed in an explosion inside a New York City apartment. The trio was making bombs when something went wrong. The FBI says that there was an error with an electric attachment. It's believed that the bombs were to be used in an attack on Columbia University's Lowe Memorial Library. A few months later, the weatherman would emerge with a statement. The opening lines read, "Hello, this is Bernadine Dohrn. I'm going to read a declaration of a state of war. This is the first communication from the Weatherman Underground." And just like that, she was back. She laid out the Weatherman's ideology and agenda. The following are just a few excerpts. Tens of thousands have learned that protests and marches don't do it. Revolutionary violence is the only way. Freaks are revolutionaries, and revolutionaries are freaks. If you want to find us, this is where we are, in every tribe, commune, dormitory, farmhouse, barracks, and townhouse, where kids are making love, smoking dope, and loading guns. Fugitives from American justice are free to go. Finally, she gave a warning. Within the next 14 days, we will attack a simpler institution of American justice. They delivered on that promise. The Weather Underground remained active for about 7 years, setting off a total of 25 bombs. About half of the bombs were detonated in the year of 1970. After that, they only set one bomb off about every 6 months. They would set the bombs off inside bathrooms, mostly government buildings. Some of their targets included the exterior of the New York branch of the Bank of Bras, the ROTC building on the University of Washington campus, the Santa Barbara National Guard Armory, a courthouse in San Rafael, California, and most notably, they bombed the U.S. Senate wing of the Capitol building, the Pentagon, and the State Department. Outside of blowing things up, the weatherman also helped free Dr. Timothy Leary from prison. He was serving 10 years for possessing 2 joints. He was counterculture and an icon advocate of LSD. The weatherman got paid $20,000 by the Brotherhood of Eternal Love for the jailbreak. They helped get him to Algeria, where he joined the Black Panther movement. He was famously quoted as saying, "World War III has begun. Join us, because we're happy and we're free and we're going to make the world free." Eventually, this became attributed to the weathermen as a way to describe their ideology. So how did this group that the FBI thought was the least harmful of the SDS turn out to start blowing up buildings? Well, the FBI's own obsession with the weathermen is partly to blame. They made them celebrities and martyrs. The FBI hung posters of members all over post offices. Everyone knew their face, especially Bernadine, who made the top 10 list and was called, quote, the most dangerous woman alive by J. Edgar Hoover. The publicity elevated their profile, giving them more power and attention than they likely would have earned on their own. The FBI connected about 4,000 people from the 1960s movements to Cuba, but only about 30 were weathermen. One Cuban official told the FBI, "We didn't start it, but we radicalized it. We gave it form. Every leader came and left with new ideas." The FBI thought that about 1,000 weathermen underground guerrillas were in the U.S. In reality, it was just about 100. They had over-exaggerated, and they knew it. Yet all those posters were still hanging. Basically, as a way to save face, they just kept going. They spent millions of dollars and used hundreds of agents for a threat that they had mostly fabricated. After making the FBI's most wanted list, Bernadine went on the run. She stayed that way for 11 years. Even in hiding, she continued to organize bombings. During this time, she wrote 22 communiques for the Weather Underground and authored a book on the cause called Prairie Fire. Bernadine wasn't alone, though. She was joined by fellow weatherman and boyfriend Bill Ayers. As fugitives, they were constantly changing their addresses, phone numbers, names, and identities. Ayers says that he had more than a dozen aliases and lived in 15 different states while trying to evade the police. Eventually, the couple married and had 2 children. The Weather Underground ended in 1977. At this time, the couple moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on Manhattan's Upper West Side. For a while, Bernadine worked in a children's clothing boutique, and Ayers was a baker. A few years later, Dohrn was a waitress, and Ayers started teaching at a daycare center. In 1980, at 38 years old, Bernadine decided to turn herself into police, surrendering in Illinois on charges of inciting mob action, aggravated battery, resisting police officers, and jumping bail. The federal charges that landed her on the most wanted list had long since been dropped. At the time, she expressed no remorse, saying, "I regret not at all our efforts to side with the forces of liberation. The nature of the system has not changed. We are menaced with constant war and the threat of nuclear destruction. I regret not at all our efforts to side with the forces of national liberation." Time and allegations that evidence was gathered illegally helped Bernadine get off with just a slap on the wrist. After spending less than a year in jail, she took a plea deal and only got 3 years probation and a $1,500 fine. Ayers was charged with nothing. Ayers infamously said, "Guilty as hell, free as a bird. America is a great country." All the excitement, all the posters, all the hysteria caused by the FBI. In the end, not one major weatherman figure was caught and no bombing was stopped. After surrendering and gaining her freedom, Dohrn found it hard to resume life. She said, "Everyone tries to make it finally over, but it is far from over. I was shocked at the anger toward me. I think part of it's reserved for women. You stepped out of the role of the good girl. She passed the New York bar exam but was denied admission because of her past. When she moved back to Chicago with her husband, Bill Ayers, she said, "I floundered around for a very long time and finally decided I did want to stay involved with kids." However, she went on to have a successful career, working as a Cook County public guardian to represent abused children. Eventually, she became a clinical associate professor of law at Northwestern University. She is now retired but lives a fairly normal life compared to the insanity of her 20s. In addition to their own 2 sons, they raised Chesa Bodine. He was a son of David Gilbert and Kathy Bodine, former weathermen who went to prison for robbing a Brinks truck in 1981 that killed 4 people. In 2019, Chesa Bodine was elected to be San Francisco's district attorney. Bernadine says the Weather Underground made a lot of mistakes. However, she makes no apologies and has no regrets about what she and her husband did back in the late 60s and 70s. In 2003, she told the online publication SF Gate the following: "When you look back at the extreme situation of that illegal, immoral war and the kind of incredible racist behavior at home, and you think of how relatively restrained the opposition was, I think that's remarkable. There weren't people attempting assassinations, there weren't people kidnapping, except for Patty Hearst. There weren't people putting bombs and chemicals into public subways. Of course, I wish we'd done things better, tidier, nicer. I wish we'd spoken more articulately. Our rhetoric was way off the charts. I mean, we thought revolution was imminent. We thought U.S. imperialism was doomed, and this was the turning point in the U.S." So what's the takeaway from this one? Well, being a good person doesn't always pay off. Bernadine Dohrn and her husband Bill Ayers blew up buildings, government institutions, essentially got away with it because they hid for such a long time. They went on to have successful and distinguished careers and run around in elite liberal circles. Their adopted son even got to be elected DA of San Francisco. Meanwhile, many of the other revolutionaries and activists in the 60s and 70s that took a more peaceful route probably didn't end up as well off as Bernadine Dohrn. They didn't get great careers and fancy paychecks and attention and book deals. Instead, they had to live normal lives with modest paychecks, all because they did the right thing and chose peace over violence. Justice may be blind, but it sure isn't fair.